Yeah, I can't hear your speaker. You speak. I can't hear your voice.
Prof. Richard, you can unmute. You can unmute your.
There we are. Can you
voice.
hear now?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
So where is Prof. Vedi?
He should be here soon.
Yes.
Mhm.
So where is he's still 31? But I think the audience would be more than 100. I think.
How many how many people for the last one on oligarchy?
On oligarchy is around, I don't know, maybe
300
around
300 participants.
300 participants. Yes. Wow.
300.
300. Yes.
Because we have quota for 300.
So only 300.
Yeah. That's
Okay.
why we use YouTube
YouTube. Yes.
in case that there's a participant who cannot enter the room, so they can see us at YouTube.
Prof.
Today,
Richard, what is your opinion about United States post-Trump era?
About the United States,
Yes, right.
well,
The
it's,
populism is, it will be still threaten democracy in United States, or
well, my guess is the next 5 years or 4 years
yes.
will be concerned with undoing all of the damage of Trump.
Okay.
And I think that it's been a blow to American democracy.
Oh,
A big blow, yeah.
Big
I think
blow. Yeah.
I think all the problems we have seen have always been there,
Mhm.
but underneath the surface.
Oh,
I think that Trump didn't cause the problems. He's a symptom of all these problems.
oh yes, right.
A symptom of them, yeah. So I despair of the United States. I think there was a very good article written by someone called Fintan O'Toole, and he said people used to admire America and now they just pity it.
That's right.
Oh, are we done today?
We're finished. You're too
Oh, we're
late.
finished. Okay. Bye.
Hi, Prof. Vedi.
as information, we can talk again about our plan with Melbourne Uni after the discussion, please, Prof. Petty and Prof. Robinson.
Yes, okay. Mm-hmm.
Last week we interrupted about the signals.
Awesome.
Stop.
So after this finishes, we'll talk for about half an hour.
Yeah, maybe it's a good one.
Yeah, because Dick has to go to his dinner party.
Yes.
Oh,
I've got to go swimming.
His dinner party is with the sharks. He's the dinner.
Oh, the sharks at the dinner. Yes.
Hey, there's somebody with a Velvet Underground profile there. Who's that? Yovenda. That's a Velvet Underground. Yeah, that was the Velvet Underground album from 1967, I think.
When you die, Vedi, a lot of useful knowledge will disappear.
Oh, Bung Wijayanto is here. Hi, Bung Wija.
Yes.
Lecturer from Diponegoro University.
I am here to remind Prof. Vedi to come to LPDS as speakers. He has an agenda.
Sorry? Remind me to what?
Remind Prof. Vedi to come to LPDS to speak with Daniel Dakidai.
Daniel Dakidai, oh yeah.
Wow. What, does Daniel miss me or something?
I think so.
Maybe he missed your contact.
Yeah, this is me, Prof. Vedi. Yeah, good to see you.
Hello, good to see you.
Yeah, that one session that you missed, right? And we're still arranging Daniel.
Oh, okay. Now, Daniel, once he's arranged himself, I'll come.
Last time Prof. Vedi said that Pak Daniel is unable to come because of he doesn't have any Wi-Fi. Yeah? Now I think he has it.
Oh, right.
Hello, Prof. I'm a big fan of your work too. I think, like everyone else here.
Hello, thanks very much. I'm hoping to get up to Indonesia, but it may be some time. We're not allowed out of Australia for a while, so we're not allowed to leave Australia.
Okay, when you have finished your dinner with the shark, yeah?
You can swim.
It's waiting on the plate downstairs. So.
Okay, Angga,
So we can start.
Can we start the discussion, please?
Okay, thank you.
We have 83 participants.
83, yeah. Till now, okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming in this lecture, in this special lecture. This lecture organized by Political Department, University of Airlangga, and it will be discussed about the politics and Islamic populism in Indonesia. Here with us is our Professor Vedi Hadiz and Professor Richard Robinson. Professor Vedi Hadiz from Murdoch University. Sorry, from Melbourne University. I remind my doctoral degree, and Professor Richard Robinson from Murdoch University. Before we start our discussion, maybe Mr. Chris Nugroho. Yeah, Dick Robinson from Murdoch. Yes.
No, he's not.
Oh no, from okay.
I'm also from Melbourne too.
Oh, you also from Melbourne. Sorry. Okay, Mr. Chris Nugroho, you can give the opening remarks for us before we start our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Pak Angga. Thank you, Professor Vedi Hadiz, and thank you, Professor Robinson. We meet again in our virtual discussion this afternoon or evening Melbourne time. We're proud of you because every participant last week very enthusiastic to see you again in this discussion. Okay, please welcome to the second discussion this afternoon. Thank you, both of you.
Okay,
thank you, Pak Angga.
Okay, thank you, Pak Chris Nugroho. Okay, I will open this discussion by paraphrasing the first sentence of the Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, a sentence in the Communist Manifesto. The specter is haunting world politics. The specter is populism, I think. If we look to the world politics today, we will know that many many political populism articulation in many countries, such as in the United States, and then UK with the Brexit, and France with the emerge of the Front National. And then not only in the European countries, but also in many countries like Turkey, led by the Erdogan president. And then in Indonesia, from the 2014 and up to date. And then in many countries like in the Philippines, in the time of populisms. Of course, that populism articulation is diverse and influence the many places, depend on the political contingency in many countries, political conditions. And today we will focus and will discuss about the populism articulation in Indonesia. I think what is the fundamental and the main question of populism today is it populism would open the gate for the reform, political reform, or populism in Indonesia become the guide or become the instrument of despotism or oligarchy? Maybe we can start this discussion about the populism, and then for the first discussion, I will give the time for Professor Vedi Hadiz. Professor Vedi Hadiz, maybe?
No, Dick.
Okay. Mr. Richard Robinson, maybe you will start our discussion. The time is yours.
Yeah. Okay. Vedi and I have divided this up. The first part is going to be about general issues of populism. How do we understand it and what are the different types? And then for the second part, which I think will be the biggest part, Vedi is going to talk about Islamic populism, historical and contemporary Islamic populism, and then he's going to talk about Islamic populism and the Ummah, and particularly moving on then to Islamic populism in Indonesia. So now, it was just mentioned that populism today is widespread. If we look back 20 or 30 years ago, nobody talked about populism. But today, populism, or what people think is populism, has spread throughout Europe, North America, Latin America, of course, where populism has been important for a long time. And I think the question is, will populism become a defining feature of politics in the future? Is it a symptom of the collapse of what we think is normal politics or the old institutions of politics? Are we moving to a new era? And if we are moving to a new era, as it was just mentioned, will this be a backward-looking populism that is anarchic and destructive, or can it be progressive and emancipatory? Or
sorry, Dick, can I just interrupt a second? We sent you slides, Bung Chris. Are you going to share?
Oh, yeah. Okay, I will tell to my colleague to present the slides, please.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Dick.
That's all right.
Good. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Good.
Okay. Well, we can move them on to the second slide. There. Now, in order to grapple with the idea of populism, we have to understand that one of the central definitions of populism is that it's a different sort of politics, a politics where the people, which is an undifferentiated mass of people, directly form alliances or with certain leaders. So the leaders become the expression of the will of the people. And the other defining feature of populism is that it's a movement against what they call elites. Now, if we're going to accept this new definition of a movement of people led by a charismatic leader against selfish elites, we have to understand who are the people, who are the elites, and who are the leaders. And we'll talk about that as we go on. The other questions that we have to ask is this: is populism just mob rule? A lot of descriptions and assumptions about populism are that populists are mindless, and it's just about mob rule, about mobs running through the streets and throwing bricks. And we've seen a lot of that in the United States recently, of course. Is populism basically backward looking and anarchic? Does it look back to a golden time? A golden time, for example, in the United States, when the white working classes had jobs, when there were not a lot of immigrants, particularly immigrants from countries with different religious or racial backgrounds crushing in on them. Do they look back to a golden age, or can politics be a progressive movement by elites and rulers? Question that we have to ask early, based on appeals to identity, that is, appeals to nationalism, race, and religion. Now, we've seen this, we see this in Europe in the 20s and 30s, in America under Trump and the Tea Party, and we see this in Latin America. Or can it be defined by class interests? In other words, can populism be a movement directed against landowners or Wall Street business people or bankers? And the answer is, of course, as we'll see, it can be both, depending on who the people are, what are the crises that give rise to populism, who are the elites and who are the leaders. Another question is populism necessarily authoritarian, or can it be democratic? Populism has often been associated with authoritarian rulers. We look in Europe, where populism became associated with Mussolini and Franco and to some extent with Hitler. In Latin America, with a range of people who turned out to be dictators. In the United States, where it became associated with, in the modern times, with Donald Trump, who was becoming more and more authoritarian as time went on. Or can populism be democratic? Can it be a movement against authoritarian rulers, as we might have seen in the early phases of populism, at least? And another question we have to ask is this: can populism last, or does it always become just another organized and institutionalized system of party politics? In the beginning, populism is often open. People can make direct claims, and the people can contact the leaders directly. But as it goes on, often the people and the popular movements, the lower movements, are pushed aside, pushed into systems of political parties or state systems of power and the military. Can populism last? Is its very nature unable to govern? You know, maybe it can overthrow governments, but can populism govern in the long term? So these are some of the questions that we must look at. So if we move along to the next slide, can we change the slide? Hello? Can we change the slide to the next one?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can we have the next slide, please? Hi. Can anyone hear me?
Yes, they're
Yes,
trying to
Prof.
get
Yeah,
into the slide.
Yes, Prof. Yes.
clear and loud.
Well, maybe I should just continue. Is that all right?
Yeah, I think
Yes.
so.
I think I'll just continue. The next question that we have to ask is this. We must understand that populism is different. It's no use trying to fit it into one model. There are lots of different forms of populism. So a lot of the questions that I posed can be accommodated if we understand the different nature of populism. I think the first thing we have to understand is what gives rise to populism? I mean, if President Trump wanted to appeal to a mass base of people with nationalist calls or calls to religion or calls to stop immigration, what made all these people out there receptive to him, that they listened to what he was talking about? What is it? And I think that the first thing we have to understand is that populism is often the populist movements and large numbers of people who are willing to listen to populist messages are thrown up by different social and economic and political crises. War is one. For example, the First World War in Europe led to a massive dislocation of people, of poverty, people coming back from the war with no jobs, the collapse of the old agrarian economy and people flooding into the cities where they had no communities, where often they only had part-time jobs. It can also be the decline of manufacturing. For example, in the United States, we find that the manufacturing base, and the same to some extent in Britain, was sent overseas to lower wage countries. And so large numbers of former working classes became unemployed or underemployed, became lost and resentful. And we also find another reason for populism is globalization and large movements of population, of immigration. So we might have a large number of people who are feeling resentful and lost because the economy has changed. Now look at large numbers of people coming into the country, as well as their jobs going out, large numbers come into the country, and these people are often racially different, different in language and culture and that, and they also see themselves being surrounded by a different culture. And populists often complain that their culture is being destroyed and replaced. That's why we have the replacement movement. We also find that the social base of populism is different. So if we're looking at populism in Indonesia, we have, well, who are the people? Who are the people who are attracted to populism? Where do they come from? Are they impoverished farmers, urbanized peasants, unemployed workers, or declining middle classes? And here we must remember, for example, in the United States today, a lot of people who supported Trump and conspiracy theories were professionals. They were educated people. They were people in the urban centres, some with university education, who were resentful, felt that they were not being valued properly. And populism also involves struggles against different enemies. Where we talk about populism being against the elites, we have to understand that populism is defined by the different sorts of elites, the nature of elites. For example, in the United States and in Australia, for example, and in lots of countries, when they talk about the elites, they don't talk about the super rich, who are the real elites. They don't talk about Rupert Murdoch or the Koch brothers or any of the really powerful economic elites, the big hedge funds. They will often see the elites as cosmopolitan, professional, middle classes, educated, people that they think are laughing at them or sneering at them or undervaluing them. Sometimes, though, populists can see the enemy as big business or global investors. So some of the conspiracy theories in America see George Soros or Bill Gates as the enemies. And sometimes, of course, the struggle is not against elites, but against different racial or religious groups. And of course, when these two collide, like when you have a black president of the United States, this fuels the situation. And populism also differs because the interests that support or finance populist movements are different. So in Europe after the Second World War, after the First World War, who supported populist movements? Well, it was fascist political movements who were on the margins, who were being out-muscled by the communists or by the old traditional conservatives. And here they found that they could see a new base for themselves. And so they were, and in America too, it was many of these big business interests were funding and financing populist movements because they could see a way that they could push their agendas. So if we now quickly move and have a look at putting these into practice to understand populism, we see, for example, between the wars in Europe, large populations were displaced by war, economic depression, the decline of old agrarian communities and agriculture. Now, we would have thought that these lost people would have been snapped up, for example, by communist movements or socialist movements, and to some extent they were. But in the battle that followed, it was the fascists with their appeals more to nationalism, to racism, to authority, to making the train stop on time, to this world of order and toughness and machismo world that won out over the communists, whose populism was directed more against big business and international capital. And that's what defined populism in Europe. It was the victory of fascism over communism in the battle to capture popular support. Today, populism in Europe is different. After a period of growth and prosperity, we find a growing reaction against educated classes and against the influx of African, Asian, and East European immigrants, and in particular, recently against Islamic immigrants into Europe. Also a reaction against the educated classes and the professional elites. In the United States, populism moved in a different way. We see in the late 19th century and early 20th century, populist movements under people like William Bryan and Huey Long were more or less socialist movements. They were bringing people together over questions of wages and income and working conditions and the price of agricultural products and the share of profits that went to farmers, and that they were largely a combination of small farmers, declining small farmers and agrarian labourers, increasingly in alliance with organised labour, and against an alliance of conservative government and big business. So that we find that this early populism was defeated by government with the backing of business and the police. Today, what we find is a new form of populism. A lot of the old socialist ideas are gone, except, of course, Trump appealed to them through reintroduction of economic protectionism, bringing industries back to the United States, rolling back liberal globalization, but also an appeal to nationalism, appeal to religion, appeals to race, and driven by the resentments of the white working classes and the business classes. So we could say that as populism in Europe in the 20s and 30s was captured by fascist political movements in a victory against communists, what we can see in the United States is that populism moved from a populism that was partly socialist to a new populism, which is anti-socialist, anti-government, and anti-educated elites. And here we have to look at how this happened through the rise of the Tea Party and Donald Trump. And of course, the Tea Party and Donald Trump didn't start everything. The Tea Party and Donald Trump were symptoms of something that was happening underneath the surface of the United States, going back to the days of the Civil War and the Confederacy. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Vedi, who's going to relate this specifically to the Islamic world, referring back, of course, to some of the questions we've asked, to some of the issues and the reasons why populism can be different. And here, as Vedi will tell you, there is a rich variety of forms of Islamic populism that have emerged from Turkey and Egypt, where Vedi's done a lot of work, to Indonesia today. So I'll finish there and hand that over to Vedi. Thanks very much.
Shall I just continue?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so, you know, from Dick's presentation, you can see that, you know, populism has been symptomatic, right, of broader social conditions, social tensions and social contradictions. And that is the case as well for the Islamic version of populism. And, you know, if we understand populism, including the Islamic versions of populism, as symptomatic, you know, we need to place its emergence within particular kinds of contexts, right? And the broad context really is that, you know, Islamic populisms have emerged over time as a reaction to you know, particular kinds of development. So, you know, just quickly, I wanted to point out that there were nascent forms of Islamic populism, and these were a reaction to the Western-dominated world of colonialism and imperialism in Muslim-majority societies, right? So, you know, in many ways, that sort of older form of Islamic populism is different from what I'll be mainly talking about. But it's important to point out because a lot of the lexicon of today's Islamic populism borrows from that period where it emerged out of a condition where people were being mobilized and you know, sort of directed to make sense of a world that was considered to be unjust because of Western colonial domination. Now, you know, the way that Islamic populism emerged in its nascent form reflected the class structure of many of these societies. So, for example, you know, if we think that some of the you know, today's Islamic populists owe their ideas to late 19th century, early 20th century people like Hassan al-Banna and so on. I mean, where did they come from? They came from, you know, sort of marginalized, small landed interests, and they came from petty bourgeois families. I mean, Hassan al-Banna came from, you know, sort of small landed interests, and you know, his parents also had a watch repair shop. You know, so you know, sort of, you know, small tradesmen. You know, this is the world from which the ulamas and so on that came up during that period developed from. And the world in which they lived in was one that, you know, was a newer world. You know, it was different from the world of their parents or grandparents. Like our world is different from those of our, you know, parents and grandparents. But even though maybe the world wasn't changing as fast as we experience it now, you know, there was nascent urbanization. You know, if you go to Java in the early 20th century, you know, the major urban centers were really just starting to develop in the early 20th century. They were sort of nascent forms of industrialization. They may have been kind of niche industries, but they were nascent forms. And through colonialism and imperialism, you know, the global interlinkages between, you know, these Muslim majority societies and the broader world, including the non-Muslim world, became stronger. And I point that out simply because even though, you know, Islamic populism in its nascent form may have been in part a reaction to, you know, sort of Western-dominated, you know, a Western-dominated world order that was considered to be unjust, you know, Islamic populists had to compete with assorted nationalists, communists, socialists, and other proponents of different ideologies to form a unified response to this condition in which they find themselves in. So basically, they competed, but sometimes they collaborated as well. We see that in Indonesian history. For example, we know that the Indonesian Communist Party, had strong links with Sarekat Islam, right? So, but what was at stake there? I think what was at stake really is, how at that time in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, you would imagine a form of post-colonial state and society that would be more just than the one that from which, to which they were responding. But the thing is, there was a question of who would benefit from such a post-colonial social order. And the fact is that even though, nationalists and so on, talk about also a kind of unified people, against colonialism and so on, in actuality, there were different kinds of people already developing because, society was becoming more complex. There were urban people, there were rural people, there were educated people, there were they were the traditional landowners, there were the peasants and so on. And basically in most of these Muslim majority societies, the people who did win out were the strata of state bureaucrats, including the military, who managed to take over the instruments and institutions of the post-colonial state and led and defined the modernization and development project. So they became the main beneficiaries, really, of post-coloniality. And so, if Islam and Islamic forms of populism was mainly or partly a reaction to the perceived inequalities of colonial society, they would find that in post-colonial society, they would also face, different but continuing forms of structural inequalities, systemic marginalization within, the processes of modernization, development, and globalization. So, I think very much ingrained within the lexicon of Islamic populism is the idea that we are the inheritors of the people who were marginalized, right, during the old European dominated order. We were marginalized during the beginnings of the post-colonial era, and we continue to be marginalized in this era of globalization. And I think, it's important to try to understand what sort of people can find appeal in the idea of, sort of responding to these sorts of systemic inequalities. And a lot of them, I would say, right now, if we look right now, would be, not necessarily the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized of the marginal, because the poorest of the poor are normally, to put it crudely, they're too busy being poor to really organize and develop it. In some ways, they're too busy thinking about their next meal in order to organize, right? It's really the people who have bought in to the project of modernization, through national school systems, through the ideas that are propagated through national media systems and so on, of upward social mobility, that find that they've encountered what I've called the broken promises of modernity. So you'll find a lot of the people who went to the 212 demonstrations, rallies in Jakarta. Was it nearly 4 years ago? They were young, lower middle class people. A lot of them would have been. Actually, I did a survey of this. Erlangga was involved. A lot of them had at least high school diplomas. Many of them had had university education. Many of them were sort of employees, you know, of the state or of private enterprises, but who found their upward mobility being stifled by the current social order, right? So these people, you know, have come up with, you know, have developed aspirations of going up the class ladder. They've developed, you know, the consumeristic aspirations of people that they can see all around them, you know, in the shopping malls and so on, and in the advertisements and on TV shows and so on. But, you know, but that world is somehow still, you know, a few steps too far, right? So, and all of this is happening in the context of rapid social change, to the extent that, you know, our previous generations wouldn't have experienced before. You know, with, for example, 25 years ago, I was doing research on factory workers, right? Now I have a student who's doing a study of workers, but she's not doing a study of factory workers. She's doing a study of what she calls the precariat. You know, people who are working class, but don't have the kind of formal, you know, sort of work arrangements, you know, with regards to salaries, rights, and so on, that even workers, as poorly paid as they were and all that, and repressed as they were 25 years ago, had, but many of these people don't. And yet, you know, these are young people, went to school and so on, and they have the same aspirations and are bombarded by the same advertisements, social media, and so on, from which they develop a sense of, I think, grievances, right? So from this, I think, you know, they try to find ways of making sense of the world. And one of the things that we talked about last week was, well, in Indonesia, certainly, there is has always been a lack of legitimacy of ideas of liberalism. And that is the case throughout a lot of the Muslim world, not uniformly, but throughout a lot of the Muslim world, partly because liberalism was equated with colonial capitalism, right? The social democratic streams of politics and even further left alternatives were basically destroyed during Cold War era confrontations with the state mainly, but also with you know, other social groups. So you know, in this sort of context, you know, the ideas that Islam, ideas of social justice and so on, that can be drawn out, you know, of the Islamic lexicon, especially from the historical experiences, you know, of Islamic struggles, can be appealing. And from this point of view, I've said before that the distinguishing factor within Islamic populism is that the concept of the ummah, the community of the believers, substitutes for the concept of the undifferentiated people that is the defining feature of other populisms. But like other populisms, the ummah, you know, like the people, are arrayed against corrupt elites, against foreign capital, against you know, various interests that are defined as infringing on the interests of the ummah. Have we lost our screen? But anyway, so that to me is the defining feature of Islamic populism, the ummah as this sort of undifferentiated mass instead of the people. So in reality, though, you know, the social basis of Islamic populism can be quite diverse, even though there's this idea of, you know, that heterogeneity being nullified by a common adherence to a particular faith and being arrayed against identified common interests. In actuality, the social bases of Islamic populism, it's the next slide now. It's the next slide now. The social bases of Islamic populism can be quite diverse. They could come from, the urban poor. They can come from the educated sections of the middle class, as mentioned before. And they can even come from sections of the modern bourgeoisie that have been relatively, marginalized compared to other sections. And in this, the best example of this really is what's called the Anatolian bourgeoisie in Turkey. So big businesses that have emerged from the 1980s and 1990s, who in alliance with the AKP, have a project of basically replacing the Kemalist politico-business elites, right? Including the big conglomerates based in Istanbul that traditionally were controlled by the people they call the White Turks. And these are basically, sort of fairer skinned, normally, elite families based in Istanbul, whereas the Anatolians come from, the provinces and the small towns and so on. But, each of these sections of the possible, social basis of Islamic populism, are depicted as being marginalized, in different ways by the existing social order, but they're unified, by this common faith, and they're unified by this common faith and having the same enemies. So what it entails really is something else that I've dubbed as the suspension of difference. So in actuality, there's a lot of difference, right, within this social base of Islamic populism, but actual heterogeneity of that social base is sort of glossed over by that appeal, to common faith. And it's a question really how long that suspension of difference can last, because you need to have either progress, right, in your political project to keep people interested, which is what happened in Turkey and to some extent until later on in Egypt, or you've got to be able to continue to mobilize your base in conflictual situations. And some of these conflictual situations in Indonesia have been made available by things like the national elections, presidential elections, local elections, and so on, where elites actually, are fighting each other, but the supporters are mobilized through a particular kind of political language. Now, the capacity to do this, to suspend difference, is not the same in all cases. So, historical legacies are important, the constellation of social forces and interests are important, economic conditions, the nature of the state, etc., all important. And therefore, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Have you got the next slide? Okay. Let me just continue. So, for example, we have different kinds of experiences in the three countries that I've studied in relation to my research on Islamic populism. That's Turkey, Egypt, and Indonesia. In Turkey, a broad social alliance under the banner of the AKP gradually attained dominance over the state over almost 2 decades, right? Arrayed against those Kemalist elites in Istanbul that I talked about that had been dominant since the days of Ataturk. In Egypt, a broad social alliance came together under the banner of the Ikhwanul Muslimin, or the Muslim Brotherhood, gradually achieving dominance over civil society, but only very, very briefly taking over the state. And it was during that one year period that Mursi was in power, and even then not fully in power, and then being deposed by the military, right? So in Turkey, you've had, Islamic populism dominating the state. In Egypt, you've had Islamic populism dominating civil society. In Indonesia, and this may be controversial to some people, I would suggest that Islamic populism has failed to dominate either civil society or the state. Why? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of it is that, an interesting aspect of this is that there is no vehicle in Indonesia that can claim leadership of the Ummah. But, there is nothing that can compare to the AKP that can legitimately, in spite of, competition from the little splinter parties that came out of the tradition of Erbakan, a politician there in Turkey in the 80s and 90s. There is no AKP in Indonesia. There is also nothing like the Muslim Brotherhood in Indonesia. So the fact that there is no vehicle, always makes Islamic populism in Indonesia a bit more fragmented and also ineffective, whether under conditions of authoritarianism or democracy. Okay, so in Indonesia, specifically Indonesia, today, I'd say that Islamic populism is also a product of perceived broken promises of modernity, the perceived social injustices coming out of the development and modernization project, out of neoliberal globalization, and an attempt to forge a response of the marginalized on the basis of an imagined unified Ummah, right? But there's been an inability to do this in an effective way, although you might say that it is a reaction really to the faults of Indonesian democracy, whereby this oligarchy-dominated democracy, right, demonstrably has not been able to develop a more just society. And you can see this really in all kinds of economic statistics about social inequalities, etc. Even though poverty levels have gone down, until recently it's gone up again with the pandemic. But still, democracy itself then loses some of its luster, and political parties and parliaments and so on also lose their luster. So, people who are critical of this, look for extra parliamentary, extra formal political vehicles to sort of, extend their aspirations and so on. A big hindrance to an effective Islamic populist alliance in Indonesia is the absence of a culturally Islamic big bourgeoisie. Unlike you have in Turkey, I was talking about the Anatolian bourgeoisie, for example, right? Or to a lesser extent, in Egypt, where in the 90s and the early 2000s, they gradually developed big businesses that were linked to the Ikhwanul Muslimin, or the Muslim Brotherhood, in the context of the dance that the Muslim Brotherhood was undertaking with the Mubarak regime at the time. In Indonesia, the big bourgeoisie remains dominated by Chinese capital and by crony capital. And of course, it's very hard to, if you're talking about the Ummah, and the Ummah being conceived as people who are marginalized, etc., it's very hard to put the big Chinese businesses within your definition of the Ummah, because they don't share that common faith. Now, the lack of a big bourgeoisie has lots of consequences. One of them is this: unlike in Egypt or in Turkey, there is an inability of Islamic mass organizations to cultivate lower class disciplined support for the Islamic populist project. because there is no money to develop sustained and really rooted charitable activities, providing social services, medical facilities to the poor. Now, if you go to places like, Cairo or Alexandria, you go to Istanbul, there are places where you can see, well, this is an Ikhwan facility. This clinic is an Ikhwan facility. And you can see that it's, the poor, the urban poor that go there. And the doctors are identified as being Ikhwan, right? You don't have anything similar to that in Indonesia. So in the absence of all of that, really, what is left for Islamic populism in Indonesia is to manifest itself at times of acute elite conflict or in anticipation of it. So usually during election time. And what does that mean? That means that Islamic populism, rather than being a challenge, to oligarchic elites, to the unjust social order that they preside over, in spite of the critique that comes out of Islamic populism, in reality, a lot of it really is ensnared, or it's been into the politics of oligarchic competition. A lot of it has been domesticated or shaped by the politics of oligarchic competition, and therefore it's not really possible to look at it as an autonomous force for a particular kind of change on the basis of an Islamic agenda. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Richard Robinson and Professor Vedi Hadiz. Professor Richard Robinson already told us about the history and the widely spread of emerging populism in many countries, and then Professor Vedi Hadiz explained about the specific condition of Islamic populism in many Muslim countries, especially in Indonesia. So we move to the question and answer section. We have 4 questions for us. First from Mr. Andi Muhammad Ibnu Akhil from Jakarta Post. He asked about the recent return of FPI leader Rizik Shihab made quite a ruckus these past few weeks, with his supporter rally around him in many events. Do you think this means the FPI and Rizik Shihab can become political force in the coming years, especially in the 2024 election? Does this mean we can no longer write off FPI as a fringe group outside the current political system? As a figure, would you say Rizik has similarities compared with other populist leaders in Indonesia? And then the second question from Mr. Haryadi, do you think Islamic populist movement have genuine concern on problem caused by neoliberal globalization, or they just make it in order to pursue their own Islamist agenda? If they do, doesn't it mean they share the same concern with anti-globalization movement? And then the third from Adeliska Pramesti, Islamic populism is closely related to the current concept of political tribalism in Indonesia, which invites sentimental values in the relationship between religion and certain political interests, such as what happened to the leaders and supporters of the Islamic Defenders Front, FPI, which has a big basis of political superiority in Islam. So does Islamic populism prove to be a very effective marketing strategy to win public sympathy? And then the last one from Mr. Ali Muhdi. In Indonesia, post-reform 1999 shows that religious leaders have considerable influence to rake in the votes in a legislative election and in the election of the region, mayor, and governor. No wonder if many of the religious leaders is elected as member of the legislature, region, mayor, and governor with a capital influence. However, in the last decade, indicating the presence of a shift and the declining influence of religious leaders for the people and his followers. My questions: why the influence of religious leaders that be a factor for vote in the general election? Second, if this indication show a collapse of the hegemony or influence of religious leader. So maybe Professor Richard Robinson can answer that questions first?
Okay, these are very complex questions, and I must say they're very good. They're very good questions. It seems to me that one of the most interesting part of the questions is whether or not Islamic populism and the leaders of Islamic populist political movements is just a cynical device for them to gain power or for them to push their Islamic agendas, their Islamic social and ideological agendas, or is it really, a genuine political movement that aims to put in place a whole series of social and economic changes? Now, this is, I think, as I said, an extremely interesting question. And I think here we have to look at the people who claim the leadership of Islamic movements. And as Vedi talked about, if we look back at Islamic populist movements, we find in the colonial years and the post-colonial years, the leadership came from the small trading families, the land-owning families, the small business families, and so on. Today, I think that if we look at the big Islamic political parties, you will find lots of the leadership have moved into those very structures that these former people criticised. A lot of them are professional politicians. They might be lawyers or business people, investors, and so on. So the question is that is Islamic populism or populism in general just a device for some people to gain power? And once they've gained power, will they then shed their populist and Islamic base? Here we find a contemporary non-Islamic example of this is Donald Trump, who came to power as a champion of populism, but once he got into Washington, he began to clean out or drain the swamp, but he drained one swamp and filled it with another swamp. That his real agenda, as you could see underneath this, was not necessarily a populist agenda. It was an agenda to replace the existing elites, the bureaucratic elites, with those business elites that he was aligned with. So you can see all his appointments came from, property developers and people like this that were his supporters. So in that sense, you could say that he cynically has used populism. Now, in Indonesia, is it the same case that leaders and the Islamic political parties are cynically using populism? Well, they may indeed believe the sorts of things that they're arguing, their religious convictions and their religious ideals. But whether this would ultimately result in the sort of Islamic society that is being sold to their popular supporters, it's very unlikely, because that world would find it difficult to exist in a contemporary world, which is, whether you like it or not, globalized. It's based on profits, it's based on corporate organization, it's based on big hierarchical governments and states. I don't know if I can say much more. My view, of course, is obviously a fairly gloomy and cynical view, and it applies not only to Islamic populism, but to all populist movements. And I think that you might find the same fate awaits most populist movements. And just one thing that your question reminded me of, and Vedi's talk reminded me of, and that is that we must see populism in a sense as a failure of liberalism. And I reading some articles about America where the reason that lots of middle-class people have supported Trump is the disappointment that liberalism promised a world of meritocracy, that people would get on the basis of merit, their efficiency, their hard work, their education. And liberalism did not deliver that to them. University graduates delivering pizzas, or cleaning swimming pools of the rich, or having part-time jobs. The failure of liberalism exists right throughout all of these cases. And yet, ironically, if these political movements, populist movements, become successful, the probability is that they themselves will be drawn into this liberal view of the world, into a world of liberal principles and ideals. So I'll leave it at that. I know that it doesn't answer some of the questions, but I hope that it might have given you room to think about some of the others. Thanks.
Yeah, to follow up on Dick's answer, look at Turkey, where Islamic populism, or the agents of Islamic populism, have been in power for 2 decades. There's nothing anti-globalization or anti-capitalism about them. They've actually decided that, capitalism and globalization, we can do good with it. We can do well with it. Why? Because a segment of their social base is the big bourgeoisie that actually, does want access to international financial markets, want access and control over markets in Central Asia, in Africa, the Middle East, and so on. In fact, the sort of difference between Erdogan and Erbakan, the previous big leader of Islamic politics in Turkey, was that because Erbakan didn't have this sort of social base in the 60s and 70s, in the 80s, he tended to be, very much your typical petit bourgeois politician who liked protectionism, the state to protect small businesses and so on, fight against foreign capital and fight against, what's his name? Bana and Said Qutb called sinful capitalism. But Erdogan doesn't talk about these sorts of things. Certainly, although they've been different phases in the 20 years he's been in power, but generally speaking, it's about bringing the Ummah into global capitalism, right? So not the Ummah challenging global capitalism, but bringing the Ummah into global capitalism. That's what Erdogan's project has been about. And partly it's been shaped by this sort of social base that he's got, right? And one of the reasons you don't have that discourse in Indonesian Islamic populism is because there is no big Indonesian Islamic bourgeoisie. So what you have basically, if you go to the PKS and so on, you look at what sort of businesses donate to them. I mean, they're small businesses. They're little, sort of owners of little shops, small milling factories, so basically the kind of the kind of people that supported Erbakan in Turkey in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? So you don't have that kind of discourse coming out of most of Islamic populism, although in Indonesia, although I have met some people, especially within the PKS, because they followed the success of the PKS. They talk the talk of globalization sometimes, but they don't have the social base for it. They don't have the social base to walk the talk, right? Now, with regards to Rizik and so on, look, I think throughout the world, what we've seen really is that, what used to be movements on the fringe, so like Le Pen in France, or the Tea Party, or the what used to be the moral majority, and then the Tea Party in the USA, and the National Front and its sort of better-looking successors in the UK. What's happened with them is that their ideas have become mainstreamed, not necessarily because they've always become more powerful. It may be the case with, for example, Marine Le Pen in France, right? But, the evangelists, sort of preachers in America and so on, what's happened really is that their agenda has been appropriated by established groups for the interests of the established groups. So, for example, there's a reason why the Koch brothers, are supporting all these churches and so on, even though they're not particularly religious in America. But the effect of that really is too, even though the people on the fringes don't necessarily take power, they are in a position to be allies of those who do take power. And that is the case with Rizik. I don't think that he is in a position, at least right now or in the foreseeable future, to be an autonomous force onto himself, because he doesn't have the resources, but he can really be a valuable ally for political parties, whether or not they're religious. Prabowo, is he religious? But you can have these strange alliances whenever it's convenient, basically, right? He has the ability to mobilize people. He has the ability to appeal to their sense of injustice, use the kind of language that would resonate with them, that other parties lack, possibly. So even though he's not in a position to, I think, take power over the state, his ideas will become more resonant, within struggles of Indonesian politics. And as they become more mainstreamed and appropriated by the people who really are in the position to fight over the institutions that, decide on the distribution of economic and political resources. So that's sort of my answer about Rizik and the meaning of his return. Are the Islamic populists genuinely against neoliberal globalization? Again, it depends. When I was in Egypt after the revolution there, the so-called revolution there, a lot of these Muslim Brotherhood people who used to be the model for some of these AKP people have turned around and looked at the AKP as the model because they were more successful. They were started to talk the talk of globalization. Why? Because they started to have these businesses as well. And they thought of themselves not as being, backward shop owners or land owning families, but professionals. A lot of them were doctors, engineers, and business people, accountants, and so on. And what they were against was the fact that a lot of people like them who had degrees from universities and so on, led a life that was not that much different from somebody who didn't. They were living in the same urban slums, in the same sort of areas, and had little, prospects of social mobility. In their idea at that time was, let's take over the state, although they started off very, very cautiously about that because of fear of the military. And then they said, let's take over the state and do it the way Erdogan did it in Turkey. But you see, what they forgot was it took Erdogan 10 years to do that. And he had to navigate through, a complexity of social forces there in order not to have the military stage a coup against him. Mursi, didn't have that organized social base, didn't have, something quite as strong as an Anatolian bourgeoisie, but he made the bet, and then the military came in and crushed them. Right, but here's a case again where you have the tradition of Said Qutb, who's very much against capitalism and so on, and then his successors in the Muslim Brotherhood of 2011, 2012, talking the language of globalization. Right. So are they truly against globalization? My answer is it depends. It depends on what their social base is. It depends on what their social position is. Okay. What else is there? What were some of the other questions? Was there a question about Islam and marketing? Well, the thing is, how do you do marketing these days? Marketing is, as a lot of people working on the media will know, is done through, social media, through buzzers and so on. And one of the things I think that that we've seen is that the agents of Islamic politics or Islamic populism have been pretty good at it. Why? Because a lot of them are engineers, computer scientists, etc. I've met people who do this. They're graduates of ITB, and I've met the same sorts of people in Egypt, who have their own software companies and so on, and Turkey, very much different from the world of Hassan al-Banna, right? And they use their expertise to market these Islamist ideas. What is what do they get out of it? Well, it's sort of the ability to shape public opinion, to mobilize people into the streets, provides them with the ability to negotiate with elites. That's what's I think the realistic aim, really. I mean, if you look at the Jakarta elections in 2016 to 2017, there were all these street rallies and so on. And then when they celebrated the victory of Anies Baswedan, the FBI wasn't even invited. Right? I mean, it shows how how temporal, how transactional all of this is. And I think the agents of Islamic populism are also learning how to play this game, and therefore developing new instruments, including being better at marketing, being better with social media, etc. Were they all the questions, Atlanga? I've forgotten.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We still have time up to 12:40, I think, for 20 minutes. Maybe if the participants have any questions, please welcome. You can raise your hand or write on the chat room. Mr. Aim, maybe.
Okay, yes. Thank you, Bung Airlangga. It's great to see my two gurus here, Dick Robinson and Vedi Hadiz. How are you?
Are you well?
I'm good. Even isolations, working studios here. Everything will be fine. Okay. Well, I think, despite we have spent more than 4 years discussing this topic, I think there are some interesting development when we talk about populism. Especially, I would like to start from Dick Robinson's presentations, the intriguing questions, in the beginning part of the presentations. I think we do agree that populism is a symptomatic for the broad social transformations. Okay, and the constituting elements of populism also explain the different characters of populism itself. I think against when we talk about populism today, there are two major contexts that is very important. The first one is, of course, neoliberal globalizations, and the second one is the crisis of institutions of representative democracy. It's all, it's happened all over the world. I think that's also explain why populism is not only in developed but also in developing countries. I think when we see the conditions today, I think my question is rather speculative. Okay, unless neoliberal globalization still become the dominant or hegemonic global order, I think populisms will always rise global politics, in the near future. Okay, I think there will be no options if neoliberal globalization is still the dominant global order, and there is no significant improvement in the institutions of representative democracy. And the problem is that which form of populism that we need. Okay, there are some experiment, for example, like in the Spain, that transform populist movement into political parties with, of course, with a limited option building alliance with other parties, and climbing of improving representative politics from within. But there's also they're also facing a problem. So in the near future, with this, the more important strategies, if populisms will become the prominent form of global politics. Okay, in the context of Indonesia, for example, the situations is rather different. For example, people still believe, for example, the rise of Jokowi in 2014, like Airlangga itself, believe that he will save democracy. Okay, but the problem, he turns into more authoritarian. So of course there are some way of how populisms, negotiate with democratic institutions. In the countries like Spain, they transform from the movement into political parties, with, of course, with some problems. In the context like Indonesia, the existing regime, the competing elite, also make use of populism, not only for make use of populism for their benefit, but they also transform the existing democratic institution. Okay, thank you.
Okay, for the next question, maybe we have in this participant, maybe Pak Haryadi, the political economic lecturer in our department. Maybe you can have any comment, maybe? Or Mas Lutijani, student of Professor Richard Robinson. Maybe you can have any comment or question, maybe? No? Luki. So we move to the chat room. We still have the questions from Dean Hafafian. Good afternoon, Prof. Robinson and Prof. Vedi Hadiz. I'm Dean Hafafian from Political Science. I would ask to Professor Robinson regarding populism in Europe. Today, the recent movement in Poland with Poland President Andrzej Duda has proposed ban on LGBT, abortion, etc. Despite populism in Europe, no, there were anti-immigrant issues. Is the central issues from populism in Britain, France, etc. Is that populism in Europe always range on right-wing values? Thank you for your attention. And then second is, maybe for Professor Vedi Hadiz and Robinson, this is the theoretical question. Then, so I make it short, which I want to know how history move in your conception of history in Islamic populism. Is it contingency or linear? Furthermore, whether the existence of certain history will ensure the formation of certain political conditions, or there must be an act to mediate between certain historical experience to produce a certain political condition. If it's so, what kind of action that able to mediate both of them? And then the other is from Mr. Andi Muhammad Ibnu Akhil. Excuse me, I have one more question. This is from the Jakarta Post. The Indonesian military, TNI, respond to FBI and Rizik rhetoric, Revolusi Akhlak, on his banners by taking down FBI banners, which many also think is a sign that the TNI is taking part of civilian matters. What are your thoughts on this? What could be the TNI intention in taking down this banner? I think this is enough for us. Please, Professor Richard Robinson, time is yours.
Okay, well, I think that the key point of the question directed at me was that about populism in Europe and whether populism in Europe is always right-wing or can it be left-wing populism? Well, I think there's important left-wing elements in all of the populism. For example, I think that the opposition to an arbitrary state and arbitrary rules, an opposition generally to big business that you find in most populisms there, including the Brexit movement. You know, it's a sort of a petty bourgeois populism, a leftism that doesn't foresee a socialist revolution, but foresees a petty bourgeois revolution. The English expect that once they remove the grip of the European Union, that things will be better, things will be freer for them. And that resonates with many left-wing forms. But insofar as I think LGBT groups were mentioned, I think that the majority of populist movements in Europe pull their central ideas from a right-wing perspective that is really against difference, whether it be different social differences in sexual orientation. I don't know many right-wing movements that have opened their doors to the gay community or other communities. Although I notice that some in Britain have said, well, no, we have people from everywhere. Well, they might include them, but they don't have an agenda or a manifesto that spells out their rights. So I would say that certainly in Europe, and I think you could generally say that right-wing ideas to protect a supposed community from outside influences is always more right-wing and doesn't have real room for left-wing or emancipatory ideas, except mainly in terms of employment and economic protection and so on. I think that's what the question asked. But if I could just quickly raise something, and that is that there is something happening in the world that may sort of make a lot of this populism redundant. And that is that we're starting to find that, or we have known for a long time, but it's starting to become obvious that the system that's in power, the form of liberalism, the form of libertarian globalism in power, is proving unable to answer some of the big questions of society, like public health. As we've seen in America, how can you fight a public health epidemic when you don't have a public health system, when you have pulled it down? Like climate change, that liberalism and the ideas of liberal capitalism have no answer for dealing with these grand and big questions of public good. And I think these questions are going to become more and more important. We're going to see shifts within the liberal world itself. We're going to see more companies like General Motors did yesterday agree to support some of the proposed environmental reforms and emission reforms. So all this is happening at the top. It's going to have a tremendous idea on politics underneath. We're starting to talk now, interestingly, about modern monetary theory. Now, this is just an amazing sort of development. The idea that the old idea of balanced budgets and as was previously consumed is now being rethought. That's going to have a massive impact on society. The discovery that governments can actually spend outside the idea of a household budget, that will change society a lot. And I think it'll change the world in which populism, if it keeps going, it'll change the world in which populism operates. But if those reforms fail and we continue to see massive climate change, the destruction of environments, public health disasters, that will also change the nature of populism and perhaps make it much more powerful. So I'll just leave those comments of mine there. And I think Vedi has got a few questions to answer from the previous round.
Yeah. First of all, on the issue of populism and neoliberalism, strangely, they are not necessarily dichotomies. In Peru, we had Fujimori, who was a neoliberal populist. So he actually, surpassed the institutions of representative politics in order to enact neoliberal reform. Okay, my example of Turkey actually shows that it is possible for Islamic populism to soften up to neoliberal globalization when it is in the interest of its leading social agents. So it's not necessarily a dichotomy, okay, first of all. Secondly, I think, if I were to maybe, riff on those last ideas that Dick put forward, I think the big question really for us is, are we entering a post-liberal world? Right? And if we are, what is there to replace it? And that is really, the huge question, for humankind at this time. The poverty of ideas, the poverty of ideology, to borrow from somebody from a while ago, is amazing. Right. So even though, we've seen that, the current liberal, political order and neoliberal economic order certainly has not answered questions of, public health, social justice, climate change, etc. Will there be alternatives that actually come up with the answers to those? Now, Dick was suggesting, uncharacteristically optimistically, that it might come out of liberalism and or neoliberalism itself. That would be nice, although I'd also sort of remind people that people were saying that after the GFC in 2008. And so, now we're talking about, okay, public debt seems to be all right. Okay, but already, in Australia, certainly, Josh Frydenberg is already moving against that, his temporary embrace of Keynesianism, right? And certainly, I don't see that we're at a stage yet where that, sort of neoliberal consensus with its its monetary economics kind of assumptions on, have been debunked to the extent that they've, been consigned to the dustbin of history. I'm still worried that they can be reclaimed. And there's certainly enough social interest, and, sort of powerful political and economic forces in the world to make sure that once and if, the current crisis is resolved, that we go back to normal, quote unquote, right? So just a bit of I suppose, a word of, a bit of caution about, about the change from within there. Now, I also would like to say something about the idea of left populism. Because of Trump, because of Dudek, is it Duda or Dudek? Duda, is it in Poland? I forget his name. Dudek was the goalkeeper, right? Dudek was the Polish goalkeeper who played for Liverpool in the final of the Champions League.
He's now Prime Minister.
Not the current leader of Poland. Because of these things, we talk about, sort of right-wing ideas and populism. But of course, there are ideas of, Aim would know the ideas of Ernesto Laclau and what's her name?
Chantal Mouffe.
Chantal Mouffe, talk about left-wing populism and so on. And of course, we've had recently Syriza, in Greece, and Podemos in Spain, right? And of course, you've had, the pink tide in Latin America. But yes, generally speaking, it has been right-wing. I think, the challenge really for forces that are both against neoliberalism and right-wing populism is actually to develop some kind of coherent left or progressive response to these things. And I don't think that Chavez has, because his response depended on oil money completely. Yeah. So it does depend on that, really. And I don't really know where that response would be forthcoming. We saw what happened to Syriza, and Podemos is not the force that it used to be in Spain before. But going back to some of the examples that Dick mentioned, I was talking to Dick over the phone about this, and people forget the original populism in America in the 1890s was actually quite inclusive. Right? They were, it was an agrarian-based populism that was against, a lot of it was against anti-Semitism. Even a lot of it was against the anti-immigration people. A lot of it was against the pro-slavery Democrats in the South, right? But that tradition of populism in America is completely forgotten now, because the social base for it doesn't exist anymore, right? So in history, from time to time, we've seen this sort of thing come up, but under current circumstances, it seems to have been overshadowed, overwhelmed by right-wing forms of populism. On history, I think the main thing about history is this. I actually don't believe in sort of linear, deterministic, sort of ideas of the flow of history, but I also don't believe in completely voluntarist, sort of conceptions either. I think the best way to put it to you is this, right? Let's say you want to change, whoever asked that question, things in Indonesia today, right? Can you do absolutely anything you want to do? No. The parameters of possibility for you have been sort of defined, right? You may have possibility A, B, C, D, but you don't have E, F, G, H, I, because of the historical circumstances that you inherited from the past, from past struggles, etc., right? And from A, B, C, D, E, right, that's open to you, they're not all equally possible. Maybe A is more possible than B. Maybe C is just slightly possible, and D and E is really possible only if there's a huge calamity, a huge revolution, you know, sort of a, you know, I don't know, something that would really shake the foundations of an existing social order. So that's the sort of way I think, you know, I think could profitably look at history, where, you know, change isn't predetermined direction of change, but neither is direction of change totally, you know, can be sort of chosen like you choose what kind of shoe you want to choose in a shop. You just can't do that, all right? And the last question about the Baliho thing, well, it just shows really that Rizik's presence in Indonesian politics and physical presence in Indonesia has to do with intra-oligarchic, intra-elite conflicts. Look at the mess with even the in the coalition that forms his government. They're responding very differently to his appearance, right? It shows that, you know, that alliance that is now at the moment coalescing around Jokowi, you know, is already planning for a few years ahead. And they all have different ideas about the role of this fellow Rizik in a few years, right? But, you know, I do want to say one other thing quickly, if I may. Sorry, I'm going on a bit here. One thing that's important to understand about populism is that it's not just the people versus the elites, right? But it's the virtuous people, right? And this is where Islamic populism actually has an avenue. Why? Because virtue is morality. And they can always look at, well, this is the code of morality that will define whether you are virtuous or not, and therefore part of the ummah or not. And the politics of inclusion and exclusion, you know, can take place through references to, you know, codified ideas of morality. Done.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Richard Robinson and Professor Vedi Hadiz, for your times. I think this is the interesting and excellent discussion. And in the next time, Departemen Politik will arrange others discussion that will invite many professor or academicians that are expert in the political studies. So thank you. I think this end for this discussion. So maybe Pak Chris will give the closing remarks, maybe.
Long live populism. No.
Thank you, Professor Vedi, and thank you, Professor Robinson. Great discussion. Thank you, Pak Angga, as moderator in this discussion. We will be in touch in December 8th on another topic about middle class in Indonesia. Participants can be join with us next month in December 8th.
You know, Erlangga could talk to that. He could call it The Middle Class in Indonesia, an autobiography.
Yeah.
Okay,
poor middle class, Prof.
Yeah, and the participant can leave the room, please.
Okay, thank you.
We will talk again about our plan. Robinson and
plan for the victory of populism.
Yes. Who will be Prime Minister? We won't have one.
Bu Dwi masih gabung ya, Bu Dwi bisa join with us in our discussion this afternoon. Please, my colleague from Department of Political Science come in for discussion this afternoon. Okay, I inform you to all participants that our discussion is finished, ended, and please, all of you can leave the room, please.
Usir nih.
Does that include Elvis Presley?
It's over. It's over.
Left the building. Yes.
Don't leave Pak Robinson. Please, please wait until some minutes. Okay.
We still have 60
Yes.
participants.
Yes. It's 3:30, the pool person's coming.
3 o'clock, Nikki's coming. You should come down and have some lunch.
Yeah, well, I can't. Well,
You got a shark in your pool.
yes. There are 3 sharks. They're little gold sharks.
When did you get a pool?
It's only a very small pool.
Oh, okay.
I think even you would be able to swim the length.
So it's not more than 2 meters long, is it?
Oh no, no.
2 meters long and 1 meter deep.
Yes.
Mas Ucu,
Ya.
surat kesediaannya. Gimana
iya.
ini?
Sudah.
Sudah?
Sudah. Kayak saya kirim ke Mbak Juril, sudah.
Ya wis.
Surat kesediaan. Orang udah presentasi kok baru ditanyain bersedia atau enggak?
Kesediaan.
I was appointed as a secretary of the Department of Political Science.
Oh,
That's not a good thing.
You're secretary of the Politburo, are you?
Yeah, that.
Hey, that's Hari over there.
Yeah.
Are you still drinking your wine with ice?
I'm still working in, Prof.
Kalau mereview partisipan yang lain gimana Feb caranya?
Only cafe, Prof.
Oh gitu. Nah ini saya pilih satu-satu soalnya.
Nanti dibantu ini aja, dibantu sama Mas Fahrul.
What are you doing? What are you doing, Mr. Ucu? Look, you are still look fat.
Look fat. He is.
Hello, Vedi. How are you?
Me too.
Good.
Yeah, he wants to be as fat as me.
Oh yeah.
Mas Fahrul, partisipan yang masih tersisa itu 27 bisa di remove ya banyaknya itu ya.
Ini ada 5 lagi nih yang mau masuk.
Iya.
Terlambat.
Selesai. Udah selesai baru masuk. Udah masuk. Prof Vedi itu Hari, Prof. Dipanggil proposalnya.
Ya, dikeluarin aja yang mau langsung.
Apa? Hari mau dikeluarin?
Dia nggak ngirim proposal.
Hari ini apa? Operatornya kebingungan kemasian.
Udah, saya remove satu-satu.
Iya.
Oh.
Loh, sih nggak di host Pak Kres gitu loh. Ya nggak bisa gitu.
Ya.
Pak Kres yang harusnya ngeluarin.
Ini saya remove satu-satu.
Ya. Pak Kres yang nggak di hostnya gitu loh.
And this is how we handle the
just a minute. I will turn off YouTube live streaming. Yeah.
Oh, there was YouTube live streaming.
Yeah. There is a YouTube live streaming.
Was there a YouTube dead streaming?
Yeah. Just a minute.